When you work in landscaping, you get used to the occasional weird job. A tree that looks too healthy for its age. A patch of soil that won't grow grass no matter how much you water it. But this was something else. I'd been hired by the Thorne Estate, a sprawling old mansion surrounded by dense woods and acres of gardens. The kind of place where the air feels heavier and the sunlight never quite reaches the ground. It was beautiful, sure, but there was something about it that set me on edge the moment I arrived. "Just clean up the overgrowth around the property line," Mrs. Thorne had said, her voice as sharp as the heels of her polished boots. "And don't disturb the main gardens." Easy enough, I thought. I spent the first few days hacking away at tangled bushes, trimming wild vines, and clearing out brambles. The job was exhausting but straightforward until I found the flowers. I was working near the edge of the woods when my shovel hit something soft. At first, I thought it was a patch of moss, but as I cleared the dirt away, I realized it was a cluster of flowers. They were like nothing I'd ever seen before. Their petals shimmered with an oily, almost iridescent sheen, and their colors shifted when I moved. Deep purple, sickly yellow, and blood red, all at once. The smell was overwhelming, a cloying sweetness that made my stomach churn. I crouched down, running my fingers over one of the stems. It felt warm, almost alive, and a thick yellow sap oozed from the base where the stem met the soil. The sap clung to my gloves like glue, and when I tried to scrape it off, it only spread. By the time I finished clearing out the flowers that day, my gloves were ruined. The yellow sap clung to them like glue, its sickly sweet smell making my stomach churn. No matter how much I wiped or scrubbed, I couldn't get the sticky residue off my tools or my hands. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air in my apartment felt heavy, and the faint scent of the flowers seemed to linger, even though I had left them miles away at the estate. The next morning, I woke up to find tiny red bumps on my left hand, just above the wrist where the sap had soaked through the gloves. At first, I thought it was a rash or some sort of allergic reaction. The bumps itched like crazy, but scratching them only made the skin feel raw. By the afternoon, the bumps had changed. They weren't red anymore. They'd hardened into small, bark-like patches that cracked when I moved my hand. Poison ivy, I told myself, though deep down, I didn't believe it. Poison ivy doesn't make your skin feel like it's splitting open. That night, I couldn't stop staring at my hand. I'd scrubbed it raw, soaking it in warm water and scrubbing with soap until my skin was red and tender. But the hard patches wouldn't budge. In fact, they seemed to be spreading, creeping slowly up my wrist and forearm. Then, as I sat there in the dim light of my bathroom, one of the patches split open. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, as a tiny bud unfurled from the crack in my skin. It was a flower, small and sickly yellow, its petals glistening with that same oily sheen as the ones I'd found in the woods. For a moment, I couldn't move, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. Then the flowers swayed slightly, as if stirred by an invisible breeze. I stumbled back, my heart hammering, and the words I'd heard so many times in my career echoed in my mind. Some plants are best left alone. By the time I woke up the next morning, the tiny flower on my hand had grown. Its petals stretched wider, their oily sheen catching the sunlight streaming through my window. The bark-like patches on my arm had spread overnight, climbing past my elbow and onto my shoulder. I tried to cut it off. Grabbing a pair of scissors, I snipped at the stem of the flower, wincing as it pulled against my skin. Yellow sap oozed from the cut, thick and sticky, and the sharp pain that followed nearly made me drop the scissors. But the flower didn't stop growing. By midday, another bloom had appeared on my wrist, its petals unfurling with the same sickly glow. I stared at it in horror, my breath catching in my throat as I realized the truth. These flowers weren't just growing on me, they were growing from me. I wrapped my arm in bandages, hoping to hide the spreading infection, but the blooms kept coming. Each new flower was larger than the last, their roots digging deeper into my skin. By the end of the day, my chest felt tight, as though the flowers were wrapping themselves around my lungs, squeezing the air from my body. Worse still, they were moving, The blooms swayed faintly, even when there was no breeze, their petals trembling as though they were alive. The next night, I woke up to the faint hum of buzzing. My heart pounded as I flicked on the light, my room instantly coming alive with movement. Insects, flies, beetles, bees crawled along the walls and ceiling, drawn to the sweet scent of the flowers blooming on my arm. One of the beetles landed on the largest bloom, its tiny legs disappearing into the yellow petals. For a moment, the flower seemed to shudder, and then the petals closed around the beetle, trapping it inside. A sharp, burning pain shot through my arm as the flower pulsed faintly, like it was feeding. I stared in horror, tears streaming down my face as the flower slowly unfurled again. The beetle was gone, its body reduced to a dark, sticky residue clinging to the petals. These weren't flowers. They were parasites, and they were feeding off me. Desperation clawed at me as I stared at the pulsing blooms on my arm. The air in my apartment was thick with the smell of the flowers, sweet and cloying, making it hard to think straight. I knew I couldn't stay there. The Thorne Estate, that was where it had started. I wrapped my arm in a fresh set of bandages, threw on a jacket, and drove back to the sprawling property, my mind racing. I had to find Mrs. Thorne. She had to know what was happening. By the time I reached the estate, the sun was sinking behind the woods, casting long, eerie shadows across the garden. The air smelled faintly of earth and decay, and the buzzing of insects echoed faintly through the trees. Mrs. Thorne was in the garden, pruning a hedge with unnerving precision. She didn't look surprised to see me. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice calm, almost cold. I pulled back my sleeve, revealing the flowers that had spread across my arm. The largest bloom trembled faintly, its petals curling inward as if sensing her gaze. "This," I said, my voice shaking. "This is what's wrong. What the hell is happening to me?" Her eyes flicked to the flowers, then back to me. She set down her shears with deliberate care and took a step closer, her gaze unreadable. "You touched them, didn't you?" she asked, her tone quiet but firm. "You knew," I said, my anger boiling to the surface. "You knew they were dangerous, and you didn't warn me." Her lips tightened, and she looked away, her expression grim. "I couldn't tell you. You wouldn't have believed me." "Believed what?" I snapped. "That your flowers are killing me?" Mrs. Thorne sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. "They're not just flowers," she said. "They're alive, a kind of parasite. They feed on decay, but when they run out of it, they find new hosts." My stomach churned as her words sank in. "New hosts," I repeated. "You mean people?" She nodded. "They're ancient, older than this estate, older than anything we know. I've spent my life trying to contain them, but they're resilient. And once they take root," her voice trailed off, and she shook her head. "Once they take root, what?" I demanded. Her gaze hardened. "There's no stopping them. The blooms will spread until there's nothing left of you, and then they'll move on to the next host." My legs felt like they were going to give out. I stumbled back, the world spinning around me. "There has to be a way to stop them," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. Mrs. Thorne dithered, and for a moment, I saw something flicker in her expression, guilt. "There is one way," she said finally, "but it's dangerous." I grabbed her arm, my grip tight. "Tell me." She looked me in the eye, her voice low and steady. "You have to burn the blooms at their source, the ones on the estate. If you destroy the heart of the infestation, you might have a chance to survive." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Burn the source, destroy the flowers. But as I turned to look at the dark woods surrounding the estate, I couldn't shake the feeling that the flowers weren't just waiting. They were watching. The woods behind the Thorne Estate stretched endlessly, their gnarled trees casting long, jagged shadows across the earth. I stood at the edge, clutching a can of gasoline Mrs. Thorne had handed me. Her instructions were chillingly simple. Find the largest bloom. That's the heart. Burn it, and you might stop the spread. Might. The word hung heavy in my mind. I had no guarantees, but with the flowers already spreading across my arm and chest, I didn't have time for doubt. The golden light of the estate faded as I stepped into the forest. The air was damp and thick with the cloying scent of the blooms, growing stronger with every step. The buzzing of insects surrounded me, growing louder, more erratic, until it felt like they were crawling inside my skull. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of moss and tangled roots. Here and there, I saw smaller flowers growing from the ground, their oily petals trembling as I passed. I gave them a wide berth, but no matter how far I moved, I could feel their presence, watching, waiting. I wasn't alone in the woods. At first, it was just a sense of movement, shadows flitting between the trees, too fast to catch. Then I heard it, faint footsteps crunching through the leaves just out of sight. I spun around, my flashlight darting through the darkness, but there was no one there. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. The forest groaned in response, the sound low and guttural, like the earth itself was shifting. The flowers around me shuddered, their petals curling inward, and the buzzing grew louder, more frenzied. I gripped the gasoline can tighter, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Whatever was out there, it wasn't human. The golden lines on my arm began to glow faintly, pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. The flowers on my skin quivered, their roots digging deeper into my flesh. Pain shot through me, sharp and searing, and I fell to my knees, clutching my chest. The blooms on my arm swayed violently, their petals trembling, as if responding to something deeper in the woods. And then I saw it. A faint, flickering light appeared ahead, casting eerie shadows across the trees. I stumbled to my feet, drawn toward it despite every instinct screaming at me to turn back. As I approached, the forest opened into a clearing, and my breath caught in my throat. In the center of the clearing stood a massive flower, its stem thicker than a tree trunk, its petals glowing with an iridescent sheen. The air around it was alive with movement, beetles, flies, and other insects swarming in dizzying patterns, their hum a deafening symphony. This was at the heart of the infestation. The ground around the flower pulsed faintly, its surface slick and wet, like flesh stretched over bone. Smaller blooms sprouted from the earth, their petals trembling as if in anticipation. I stepped forward, my legs trembling, and uncapped the gasoline can. The golden lines on my arm flared brighter, burning like fire, and the flowers on my skin quivered violently, their roots twisting deeper. The heart of the bloom seemed to sense me. Its massive petals began to unfurl, revealing a dark, gaping center that pulsed with a sickly yellow light. It was alive. The buzzing grew louder, a deafening roar that made my ears ring, and the smaller blooms around me surged upward, their roots reaching for my legs. I screamed, dousing the massive flower with gasoline as the roots wrapped around my ankles, pulling me closer. The pain in my arm was unbearable, the flowers on my chest blooming wildly, their petals dripping with yellow sap. With trembling hands, I grabbed the lighter from my pocket and flicked it open. The heart of the bloom shuddered, its dark center widening into a yawning maw, and I felt the pull. The same pull I'd felt in my chest, but stronger, deeper. It was trying to consume me. I threw the lighter. The clearing erupted in flames. The fire spread faster than I could have imagined. The moment the flames touched the massive flower, it let out a sound, a low, guttural howl that rattled the very air. The petals convulsed, their oily surface catching fire instantly, and the sickly sweet scent of the blooms was replaced with the acrid stench of burning sap. The smaller flowers on the ground ignited next, their stems writhing as they went up in flames. The insects swarming around the heart scattered, their buzzing turning into a chaotic frenzy as the inferno consumed the clearing. The roots wrapped around my legs tightened, pulling me closer to the massive flower even as it burned. The golden lines on my skin flared brightly, the heat from the flames mingling with the searing pain coursing through my body. I struggled against the roots, kicking and clawing, but they were relentless. The flowers on my chest bloomed wildly, their petals dripping sap that hissed and bubbled in the heat. The massive flower trembled, its dark center pulsing violently, and I felt the pull intensify. It wasn't just trying to consume me, it was trying to survive. The fire reached the base of the massive flower, and the ground beneath me shuddered violently. The roots around my legs began to loosen, writhing as if in agony, and I used the moment to wrench myself free, stumbling backward onto the scorched earth. I fell to my knees, gasping for air, as the flames climbed higher, engulfing the massive bloom. Its petals curled inward, blackening and cracking, and the golden light from its center dimmed, flickering like a dying ember. The smaller flowers around the clearing withered one by one, their oily sheen turning to ash. The buzzing of the insects faded, replaced by the crackling of the flames and the groaning of the earth. For a moment, it seemed like the fire would consume everything. But then the massive flower let out one final, piercing wail, and the golden light flared brightly, blinding me. When the light faded, the clearing was silent. The massive flower was gone, reduced to a smoldering husk. The ground around it was charred and lifeless. The smaller blooms, nothing more than piles of ash. The air was heavy with the scent of smoke and burned sap, and the forest was eerily still. I staggered to my feet, my legs trembling, and looked down at my arm. The golden lines had faded to faint scars, and the flowers that had been blooming from my skin were gone, their roots withered and blackened. It was over, or so I thought. As I turned to leave the clearing, the ground beneath me pulsed faintly. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, as a faint, golden glow began to spread through the ash. "No," I whispered, stumbling back. The glow grew brighter, threading through the charred earth like veins, and the air around me grew thick with the scent of the blooms. The heart of the infestation wasn't dead, it was regenerating, and this time it was faster. The golden lines on my skin flared briefly, sending a sharp pain through my chest, and I realized with a sinking dread that the fire hadn't destroyed it. It had only made it stronger. The ground pulsed harder beneath me, sending vibrations up through my legs. The faint, golden glow spreading through the ash intensified, casting long shadows across the clearing. I stumbled backward, gripping a nearby tree for balance, as the charred remains of the massive flower began to move. The burned petals shuddered, their blackened edges cracking and falling away, revealing fresh, oily blooms sprouting beneath. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, I burned you. You're done." But it wasn't done. The golden light surged, threads of it winding through the ash like veins, and the roots that had withered moments ago burst from the ground again. They were thicker this time, glistening with yellow sap, and they moved with purpose, snaking toward me like living things. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest was alive with sound now. The groaning of trees, the buzzing of insects, the relentless rustling of roots chasing after me. The fire I had started had bought me moments, but the heart of the infestation was fighting back, and it wasn't letting me go without a fight. The trees around me seemed to shift as I ran, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. My feet caught on exposed roots and uneven ground, but I didn't stop. The golden lines on my skin flared with each step, burning hotter as the pull of the heart grew stronger. I reached the edge of the clearing, where smaller blooms sprouted from the forest floor, their petals trembling as I passed. The oily scent of the flowers was overwhelming now, clinging to my clothes and filling my lungs with every breath. The whispers returned, faint and insistent, weaving through the sounds of the forest. "You cannot escape. The heart endures." My chest ached as the golden lines pulsed brighter, and I stumbled to my knees, gasping for air. The flowers on my skin, which had withered moments ago, began to stir again, their roots pushing deeper into my flesh. "No," I groaned, clawing at my arm, but it was no use. The blooms were regrowing, their oily petals unfurling with a sickening slowness. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic chorus. "You are part of us? Feed the heart." Through the haze of pain and fear, I saw a faint light in the distance. It wasn't golden like the blooms. It was warm and flickering like firelight. Hope surged in my chest, and I forced myself to my feet, staggering toward the light. The roots chased after me, tearing through the undergrowth, but I didn't stop. As I broke through the trees, I saw it, a small, makeshift campsite, the flames of a fire crackling in the center. A figure stood by the fire, silhouetted against the light. "Help!" I shouted, my voice raw. The figure turned, and I froze. It was Mrs. Thorne. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken, and the golden lines on her skin glowed faintly in the firelight. "I told you," she said, her voice flat. "The heart always endures." The roots surged past me, wrapping around my legs and dragging me toward the fire. The golden glow in the clearing flared brighter, and the oily blooms quivered with anticipation. The forest pulsed in time with my heartbeat, and I realized with a sinking dread that Mrs. Thorne wasn't here to help me. She was here to make sure the heart survived. Mrs. Thorne's expression was unreadable, her face eerily calm as the roots coiled tighter around my legs. The firelight danced across her skin, illuminating the faint golden lines etched into her arms, the same lines that burned across mine. "You knew," I gasped, struggling against the roots. "You knew it couldn't be stopped." Her lips curved into a small, bitter smile. "Nothing this old can be stopped," she said. "The heart is as much a part of this place as the soil and the trees. It's been here long before us, and it will be here long after. Then why send me in?" I shouted, my voice raw with pain and fury. "Why tell me to burn it?" "To feed it," she said simply, stepping closer. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The fire wasn't meant to destroy the heart. It was meant to strengthen it. The blooms had withered temporarily, but the flames had awakened something deeper, something more ancient and insatiable. "You used me," I said, my voice trembling. Mrs. Thorne tilted her head, her gaze cold. "You were already part of it the moment you touched the blooms. I just accelerated the process." The roots tugged harder, dragging me toward the center of the clearing. The golden light flared brighter, spilling across the ground like liquid, and the pulsing in my chest grew sharper, syncing with the rhythm of the heart. The massive flower I had burned was regenerating, its petals unfurling slowly, glistening with fresh sap. The air was thick with the scent of decay and sweetness, and the whispers had returned, louder and more urgent. "Feed the heart. Become one with us." I clawed at the roots, my nails tearing against their rough surface, but they were unyielding. The flowers on my skin bloomed wildly, their roots burrowing deeper, feeding on me with every pulse of the heart. Mrs. Thorne crouched beside me, her gaze distant. "It's better this way," she murmured. "Better to give in? Fighting only makes it hurt more." I glared at her, fury and desperation boiling in my chest. "Why are you still here? Why haven't you escaped?" She let out a hollow laugh. "Escape," she echoed. "There is no escape. The heart is in me, just as it's in you. It keeps me alive, but only so I can keep it alive. That's the deal. The deal." The words felt like a noose tightening around my neck. I looked at the massive flower, its center pulsing with golden light, and the realization settled over me like a shroud. The heart didn't just consume, it converted. It turned people into caretakers, forcing them to sustain its endless hunger. I wouldn't let that happen to me. With a surge of adrenaline, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the lighter I had used earlier. The roots tightened around my arms, trying to pull it away, but I fought against them, gritting my teeth against the searing pain. Mrs. Thorne's eyes widened. "What are you doing?" "Ending this," I growled. I flicked the lighter open, the small flame casting a warm glow against the cold, golden light of the clearing. The roots shuddered, recoiling slightly, and the flowers on my skin trembled violently, their oily petals curling inward. "You'll burn with it," she shouted, lunging toward me. "Maybe," I said, locking eyes with her, "but at least I'll take it with me." I thrust the lighter toward the nearest root, the flame catching instantly. The golden light around us surged, and the forest erupted into groaning trees and shrieking whispers. The fire spread quickly, consuming the roots and racing toward the massive flower. Mrs. Thorne screamed, her voice drowned out by the roar of the flames, as the clearing was engulfed in a fiery inferno. The flames tore through the clearing, devouring everything in their path. The massive flower writhed as the fire reached its base, its petals curling inward like a dying beast. The golden light pulsing from its center flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across the burning woods. The roots gripping my arms and legs loosened, writhing frantically as they caught fire. I clawed at them, pulling myself free, and stumbled back toward the edge of the clearing. The flowers on my skin bloomed wildly, their oily petals trembling as they burned, releasing clouds of thick, acrid smoke. I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath, as the heart of the infestation let out a deafening wail. It was a sound unlike anything I had ever heard, low and guttural, filled with rage and agony. The ground beneath me shuddered violently, splitting open in jagged cracks that glowed faintly with golden light. Mrs. Thorne stood at the edge of the flames, her face illuminated by the inferno. Her expression was unreadable, but the golden lines on her skin flared brighter, casting an eerie glow across her pale features. "You fool," she said, her voice low and trembling. "You do not understand what you have done. It's over," I rasped, clutching my burned arm. The flowers on my skin were withering, their roots retreating as the fire spread. "I destroyed it." She shook her head, her gaze fixed on the massive flower as it burned. "You did not destroy it. You only made it angrier." As if in response, the heart of the bloom surged one final time, its pulsing light flaring brighter than ever. The flames consuming it were momentarily snuffed out, replaced by a blinding golden glow that filled the clearing. I shielded my eyes, the heat searing my skin, as the heart released a wave of energy that rippled through the forest. The trees groaned, their branches twisting violently, and the air was filled with the sound of cracking wood and falling debris. The golden light dimmed, leaving only the smoldering remains of the massive flower. The ground stopped shaking, and the whispers fell silent, replaced by the crackle of dying flames. I stumbled forward, my legs weak, and stared at the charred husk of the bloom. The golden light was gone, and the oily sheen that had coated its petals had evaporated into ash. "It's done," I said, my voice hoarse. "It's finally done." Mrs. Thorne laughed bitterly, her shoulders sagging. "Done," she repeated. "The heart cannot die. You have only delayed the inevitable. It will regrow, stronger than before." I shook my head, unwilling to believe her. "No, I burned it. I destroyed it." She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "And yet, you still feel it, do you not? The pull, the hunger." I froze, my chest tightening as her words sank in. The golden lines on my skin had faded to faint scars, but the ache in my chest remained, a hollow, gnawing emptiness that I couldn't ignore. The heart wasn't gone. It was still inside me. Mrs. Thorne leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "You are its caretaker now. The heart lives on, and you are bound to it." The realization hit me like a blow. The fire hadn't freed me. It had marked me. I wasn't just part of the heart anymore. I was its keeper. The forest was quiet now, the whispers silenced, but I knew they would return. The heart always endured, and now so would I. The forest was silent, unnaturally so. The crackle of the flames had faded, leaving behind only scorched earth and the faint, acrid smell of burned sap. The massive flower was nothing more than a blackened husk, its jagged remains twisting upward like gnarled fingers reaching for the sky. But Mrs. Thorne's words lingered in my mind, heavy and unrelenting. "You are its caretaker now. The heart lives on, and you are bound to it." I stood there, trembling, staring at the charred ground where the roots had once writhed. The golden lines on my arms had faded almost completely, but the hollow ache in my chest remained, a constant reminder of what I had done. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Mrs. Thorne stepped forward, her face unreadable in the dim light. "You wait," she said simply. "Wait for what?" I demanded, my voice rising. "For it to grow back? For it to take me?" She sighed, her gaze drifting to the ruined flower. "The heart is patient. It will regrow, yes, but not here." Her words sent a chill through me. "What do you mean, not here?" "The heart is clever," she said. "It knows when it has been discovered. It will retreat, hiding itself in another place, another form. And you will feel it wherever it goes. You will feel the pull." I staggered back, my mind reeling. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I burned it. I destroyed it." Mrs. Thorne tilted her head, her expression softening for the first time. "You cannot destroy something like this. You can only delay it, contain it. And now, that burden falls to you." I wanted to scream, to argue, to do anything but accept what she was saying. But the hollow ache in my chest told me she was right. The heart wasn't gone. It had simply moved on. And somehow, it had left a part of itself behind. Mrs. Thorne turned and began walking back toward the estate, her steps slow and deliberate. "You should leave this place," she said over her shoulder. "There's nothing left for you here." I dithered, my gaze lingering on the charred remains of the massive flower. The forest was still, the golden light gone, but I could feel it, the faintest pulse, like a distant echo of the heart's rhythm. I turned and followed her, my legs heavy with exhaustion. When I returned to my apartment that night, everything felt wrong. The air was thick, the shadows deeper, and the faint scent of the flowers clung to my clothes no matter how much I scrubbed. The scars on my arms itched, the golden lines glowing faintly in the darkness. I stared at them, my chest tightening as I realized they were pulsing ever so slightly in time with my heartbeat. And then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic hum, so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. But I knew better. The heart wasn't gone. It never truly left. Somewhere in some forgotten corner of the world, it was growing again, feeding, waiting. And when it called, I would have no choice but to answer.